All right, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to this session of the California Democratic Party on racial justice. We're going to give it just a moment and allow everyone to come in and join us, and then we will get started with our program. Thank you all for being here. All right. Well, I think we've got a number of our attendees who have joined us. And so again, I'm Rusty Hicks, Chair of the California Democratic Party, and certainly want to welcome each and every one of you to this session on racial justice, becoming an anti-racist organization. Many of you were a part of the general session that we just left, and you heard the words of Assemblymember Weber, Dr. Weber, who called upon us to celebrate, but also to recommit ourselves to all the great work that we have in front of us. This evening, I wanted to share a couple words before turning it over to Katrina and Preeti that will walk us through a really important conversation and dialogue. I think we can all recognize that 2020 has been a year like no other. We've all come face to face with a global healthcare crisis, an economic downturn, the ravages of climate change, and white supremacy on full display. And while 240,000 plus Americans have succumbed to a virus, while millions are impacted by fires and floods, while tens of millions have lost their jobs, it is communities of color, and in particular Black Americans, who have experienced the disproportionate burden of those tragedies. Yet the May 25th killing of George Floyd, at the knee of yet another police officer sworn to protect and serve, embodied the deadliest tragedy of them all: a deep racism and white supremacy, or maybe framed another way, white dominant culture, behaviors, and practices that flow from the very foundation of our country. We all watched in horror. Frankly, the world watched in horror for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while George Floyd begged for his life. We were angry, we were sad, we were broken, and yet we are still here. And over the last 6 months, we collectively transformed our marching in the streets to an overwhelming march to the polls to defeat Donald Trump, a man who spent his life stoking the flames of racism and bigotry with reckless abandon. And we won, electing Joe Biden and our very own Kamala Harris, the first woman, the first Black woman, a woman of Southeast Asian descent, a woman with an immigrant story, to the White House. And we know that we will see them both sworn in on January the 20th. But I think we have to reflect on the fact that Donald Trump got 72 million votes, more than 10 million more than he got in 2016, the second highest number of votes for a presidential candidate in American history. But I think we also have to recognize that Trump's electoral success, even in defeat, is a symptom of a much deeper illness in this country, an illness of unfulfilled promises made to communities of color. It's not about Trump. It's never was. It's about what he stands for. A blatant racism and deep-seated white supremacy that now lives out in the open for all to see. A relentless barrier to a fair and equitable chance for so many communities of color, and in particular Black Americans, to define and live their best lives. The real question for all of us is, what are we going to do about it? Not just what would we do about it in the days and weeks after a tragedy, what would we do about it in this moment, in 2 years from now? Will we look away? Will we change the subject? Will we continue to move from one tragedy, one painful crisis to another? I believe that all of us, especially white people like me, have a responsibility to engage in the tough conversations and do the hard work to proactively question and dismantle those systems and structures and policies and procedures and behaviors that leave communities of color in a perpetual cycle of pain, the result of a very long list of yet unfulfilled promises. I know that I have a role to play, and I believe each and every one of you do as well. So, will we commit to both personally and organizationally confronting the racism, white supremacy, and all too common white dominant culture that prevents communities of color from defining and living their best lives? Will we recognize anti-Blackness in the way in which it harms every community of color and all of us, and accept our collective responsibility to rid it from our society in every form? Will we invest in fully understanding what it means to be, quote, anti-racist, understanding what that actually means? Will we do the hard work required to become anti-racist as individuals, as an organization, and as a community? Will we be strategic, thoughtful, intentional, putting an anti-racist lens on all of our systems and structures, our practices and policies, and more importantly, our hearts, our minds, and our behaviors? Admittedly, I don't have all or maybe any of the answers, and that's okay. But what I am willing to do in this role within this party and as an individual in this country and in this world is to push all of us to ask the tough questions, to face the hard truths, to do the hard work required to be a personal and organizational vehicle to help improve people's lives, for those that we know and for those that we don't. I know that this journey will not be easy or perfect or fast, but I do know that we and the millions of Californians we serve will be better off because of our collective work. And now I want to turn it over to my colleagues Katrina and Preeti, who will lead us through a discussion on how we embark upon this important work and journey together. Katrina and Preeti.
Thank you, Rusty. It's so great to see you all. And thank you to Preeti, who is here with me to take us through just an acknowledgement of this initiative that you all are embarking on. I want to thank Rusty and Yvette for approaching us and collaborating with us and thinking about what this needs to look like, what the journey should start to look like, I should say. And while we do that, before we get into what does that journey actually look like, what we thought we'd do with you today is really touch a little bit on what Rusty brought forward as being, what's the foundation, right? What is this foundation that might explain about why this is so important to the state of California right now, right? If I can ask that we move to slide 5 to really take us through. So Rusty was sharing a little bit about some of the just the nature of where we are right now. And he spoke a little bit about the fact that racism exists. But one of the important things to know is that we should all just be clear about what does it mean? What is racism? Like, let's just talk a little bit about that. And so I'm going to give you a definition of what racism is. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how it shows up over the centuries that really speaks to the foundation that Rusty spoke about, right? Which will tell you a little bit about why this is such an important thing to talk about as an organization. So racism is race prejudice plus power. It's the combination of both of these two things. And when we talk about racism, we are talking about a system of structuring opportunities and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks. So when you think about this in terms of the spheres of inequity, right, which you should see in front of you, what we're talking about is spheres of inequity are basically racism, how racism shows in our systems, in our structures, in our institutions, in our day-to-day interactions with others. And then how does it show up inside of our unconscious bias, right? How has it influenced us in every day? So let me walk you through the spheres of inequity, or how racism shows up in each of these structural systems. So when we talk about structural racism, we are talking about racial bias, right? And discrimination amongst institutions and across society. And it has a cumulative and compounded effect of racial factors that systemically advantage white people while producing adverse outcomes for Black people and other people of color. So that is structural racism. And we see this when we talk about these systems, these institutions. We're talking about education, we're talking across the board, banking, media, healthcare, to those types of structures. And what we know is that that is dominant culture at its core. It navigates and it permeates everything around us.
Kat, what that makes me think about,
Mm-hmm.
even as an individual, if I feel like I'm doing my very best not to be anti-racist, by nature of being a part of these structures, I
Right.
am participating in racism, right? And so for me to own that and to be able to see the structures that I'm a part of, I think is so powerful with this slide.
Exactly, exactly. And what we know is that because of those systems, Preeti, because of the structures that exist, we know that our institutions naturally, our laws, our rules, our policies are influenced by this. And so naturally, you see that at play. And when we see that at play in our institutions, we also know that it permeates, and you see it in the biased interactions between individuals, both conscious and unconscious. You see it in teams, you see it in organizations. And given the fact that it is all around us, right? It's all around us. As an individual, it is hard. What this slide is saying, it is hard for us to separate ourselves out of not being impacted or influenced by what exists. And what I love about this slide, Preeti, is that it calls all of us into being aware and acknowledge in what ways, it invites us into acknowledging in what ways has our bias been influenced by the media, by the laws, by the systems, by our engagements with others, by our families. All of this has influenced us as individuals.
I've heard this concept a lot actually recently. We've all been celebrating the recent election results, and there has been a great saying where folks are saying, we don't want to go back to normal because normal is this, right? We want to get back to better. And I think that is a really, that's calling us to the idea of let's not take for granted anymore what our systems and our institutions are.
Absolutely. Build back better. I can't tell you how much I just so love the phrase and the slogan. And what I am excited about is not only is that something that we're hearing now in this, with the Biden-Harris administration, but the California Democratic Party is interested in also thinking about it that way. What does it need to look like? Let's not go back to normal. Let's find out what is building better, right? So with that, I feel like it's important for us to, with that context of how to navigate these waters, let's just talk a little bit about how our foundation of rules, laws, policies have shaped over the centuries to influence where we are now. And so these next couple of slides, what I want to invite you to do, we are going to share with you a number of dates and policies and laws that have been put in place over each of the 5 centuries. And we want you to take a look and see, what are you noticing? What's emerging for you? What are the themes that you could see about these policies? So let's go to the next slide and just kind of walk through a few of these. And I know Preeti's been looking at these and has a couple of thoughts about these as well.
We could go to the next.
Next slide. And just keep going through So notice what you're noticing. These policies have been put in place from the very get-go, from the genesis of this country, with the bringing in and the arrival of Africans into the Virginia colony.
And I mean, it's impossible to do justice to a century worth of history in one slide. So of course, we've only picked a few to show you examples. But for me, what stood out here, first of all, 500 years ago, what stood out to me was, this is just the blueprint, right? This is the blueprint for how folks in power, not just in the United States, but across the world, have taken this against other communities of color, from Chinese immigration a few decades or generations later, to even the post 9/11 response. This idea of othering and the power dynamics that were created in the 1600s continue, and we see woven through many of the policies in subsequent centuries.
Right. So notice what you're noticing. Let's go ahead and move over to the 1700s and see how it's evolved from the 1600s to the 1700s. So, Preeti, the one thing that I was noticing on the slide before was that there was a no fraternization policy that was put in place, whereas before it was okay for like Africans and Blacks to mingle and to own property and do all the things, and yet there was a systemic, like the laws that started to pull back the rights of Black people in this country.
Power is rising with numbers.
Right. And that capitalism was kind of weaving through. It was because of that, right?
I was really interested in 1793, forgive me, the idea of the cotton gin, right? Creating an economy that requires these structures to be in place. It called to mind, you know, what's happening today, what's happening with our essential workers, what's happening with all of the agricultural work that's happening in Central California. How are those industries really reliant on folks who have less power? And what structures and systems are in place to maintain that dynamic?
Right, right. Let's go to the next century. Take a look and see what you're noticing. I think as the centuries went, we did a little bit better on the number of dates.
They're more familiar as well.
And they're more familiar. Yes, absolutely. What are you noticing? Feel free to drop it into chat. Feel free to.
You see these policies are shifting in almost micro steps, right? For every court case that we have on the slide, there are 30 before and after. It's not closing a door in one swell foot. It's shifting and adjusting, almost sometimes in a way that you can't tell that power has been retained.
Exactly, exactly. And what I also find interesting in these policies is that even though there are points where you see that something is given to people of color, there's an extension of like, yes, we're going to do this. It's almost as if you move 2 steps forward and 15 steps back, right? Something gets yanked away. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide.
Kat, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. There is a question as to whether we may be able to provide a copy of these slides. I think that's
of course, we're happy to. And as I said, there's actually, we'll send out a resource guide. There's an entire, there's like a booklet and as well as a book called The Color of Law, where some of these are actually in it as well. So what are you noticing? Preeti? What's standing out for you?
I mean, you know, my work history has a lot to do with banking policy and home ownership. And so here it's not a bullet, but I'm thinking about the Federal Housing Act. I'm thinking about access to education, the GI Bill, thinking about who had that access and what does that mean for generational wealth through the 1900s and to today. And so, you know, on one hand, there's so much work for exclusion, and yet at the same time, when we're building wealth, where is that landing?
Right. And oftentimes,
exactly.
And what we oftentimes also see, and what I feel like it's important to lift up for things that are given, like when you say the GI Bill, we also know that while that might have been offered at a federal level, what we see at the local, right, and the county levels, that the laws and policies that were put in place to make sure people couldn't access or couldn't do buy homes, or they were deeds that were the covenant policies that were put in place to ensure that neighborhoods were not integrated, right? So there's a lot of these types of things where policies might be given, but yet taken away, this back and forth. Let's go ahead and go to this last century, which is, our 2000s, right? This is closer, things that you may see and you may notice now. And Rusty brought up a really great point. This pandemic has created levels of are highlighting health disparities that are existing across for people of color. What I do know is that throughout, like for the last 1900, late 1900s till now, women of color in the US fare significantly worse than white women in every aspect of reproductive health. We also know that maternal mortality rates impact Black women nearly 4 times more, right, in childbirth than white women. We also know that there's racial disparity in the juvenile justice system, right? Black youth represent over 17% of their age group within the general population, right? They represent 46% of juvenile arrests and 31% of referrals to juvenile courts and 41% of waivers to adult courts. And that one's really touchy for me and dear. Like I used to work in a juvenile justice system and it used to break my heart.
We're
Any
seeing,
additional thoughts?
yeah, no, just some of the comments are saying, of course, the list that we have here is unfortunately woefully small, right? We've got Oscar Grant. We've got so many other names that we could add to people who have experienced violence just in the last 20 years. And
exactly.
These 5 decades, most of this information is not new to anyone in this Zoom today, but to see it all together, to see it building layer upon layer, and to be able to understand the Occupy movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the police brutality in the context of these 500 years, to me felt like it just felt it's not its own thing, right? It's the system going back to the spheres of influence that feels so much more urgent.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is a time where it requires that we do better, not go back to normal, but do better. Do more, do different, right? So let's go on to the next slide, if you don't mind. Yes. What we want you to do is in the chat, please share with us, what are you noticing about these policies? What are you noticing about these policies? Go ahead and share with us what's standing out for you. Drop it into the chat. We want to hear from you. We want to get your reflections.
It hurts. I'm seeing that it hurts. Racism hurts. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
The basic nature of it.
It hurts all of us. At the end of the day, it hurts all of us.
Thank you for the comments.
They continue to be pervasive. Absolutely, Kelly. They are linked. They are definitely linked to economic issues. They are tied to each other.
Often created by economic issues, right? From economic issues.
That's right. What else is coming up for you? The reoccurring legal repression and exclusion. That's right. Let's let's go to, there's one more question that I want you all to reflect on, and that is, in what ways has anti-Black racism shown up this year and during this election cycle? This has been a really hard year for all of us. Exactly. Voter suppression. That is absolutely right. What else is showing up? In what ways has anti-Black racism shown up this year? Make it more difficult to dismantle centuries of de facto racist policies. Now, here's the thing. So I'm a bit of an idealist and an optimist, right? And I have to say, one of the things that I have noticed, my family lives in Arizona. I never thought in all these years that Arizona would go blue. But what we know is that the more we can inform ourselves and others, the more we work on this. It is not, as Rusty said, it is not a sprint. This is a marathon, and it takes a lot of work. And what I know about the organizers that I have been supporting over these years is that Arizona has always been in the eye, right? They've always had their eye on it. And I know some folks that have gone out to Arizona and actively organized, politically organized. And there's a lot of work being done to inform voters, people, about how anti-Black racism has showed up, how racism is showing up in our systems and structures. And this year, I felt like, because of all the pain and trauma that we have seen perpetuated, that people are beginning to listen, right? As I said, awareness is important. It's that first step. And it is a long journey. I'm loving what I'm seeing in the chat, Preeti.
I want to lift up one comment because, this is all, it's pretty heavy. And a comment I saw was, there's a lot of resilience, right? This has been going on for centuries, and communities, Black communities and communities of color, continue to lift up. They're the ones who are raising their voices and creating this change.
Yes, yes. And the thing that's important is it can't, like, our communities of color are rising up. And what we do know is that the country is still 80% white. And so we need everybody to rise up and to remove the lens, the rosy colored lens, and actually see what is going on. And so part of this process of what Rusty is out, like what we've been thinking about together is, let's move to the next slide, is, how do we move forward in building and becoming an anti-racist organization? What should groups do and think about as we move forward, right? How should the party be thinking about this? And what we want to invite is that the purpose is to foster greater belonging, right? In order to address anti-Black racism, is to foster a greater belonging within its systems and structures and its practices. And what we're inviting folks to do is, the party to do is to begin by first understanding how anti-Black racism impacts our communities in California and the issues that are most important to them, right? That matter most to them. And to develop a deeper understanding of what belonging and inclusion means. Identifying what othering is, how is it showing up in everything? And then talk about, what does belonging and inclusion mean? What does it look like and feel like for your communities? How can the party become a party that is valued and respected and trusted by communities of color and youth.
In speaking to some of the comments, for us, this idea of othering and racism really is, the genesis is in Native populations and anti-Black racism, but it's the model for all disenfranchised communities, not just communities of color. And for us to flip the narrative, right? When we work on anti-racism, we all benefit. And I've seen some comments that, white folks are having trouble with that sometimes across the country, right? What does that mean? Is there an us versus them element? So I think that's certainly part of what we're going to be talking about. Who benefits, right? What is the purpose?
Right. The paying attention to anti-Black racism creates space. Like, it is, when we look at the systems and policies and practices for the centuries, have really been about marginalizing all people of color, but very specifically Black people. And so when we can address anti-Blackness, right, this notion, right, then we can actually create and open it up for everyone to benefit, right? So let's
the root
take
of the tree.
What's that?
I was saying the root of the tree.
That's right, the root of the tree. The root of the tree, yep. So let's talk a little bit about, like, we've outlined, Preeti, you and I, we've outlined this process to begin the conversation about what does it mean to, like, what does belonging mean, and what should, how the party can actually foster greater belonging. And what we want to do is share with you just what does that journey look like right now, like our best thinking about it right now, having worked with organizations to do this. And what we do know is that one of the major outcomes that we want to have, at least in this initial phase, because it is a journey and it takes time, right? It's not going to happen overnight, is that there is a work group that we will pull together with Rusty and Yvette and the party's help to go through a process, an exploration process. And that group will ultimately make recommendations on what the party can do differently to foster greater belonging and in becoming an anti-racist organization. What might those steps look like? And they're going to bring that back. And so let's take a look at what that journey might look like. So if we can go to the next slide. So Preeti, you and I, we started a little bit sooner than just this meeting today, right? We actually started back in August, September with a series of stakeholder interviews, which were with folks from across the state who are within party leadership as well as outside the party, community leaders. And those were one-on-one interviews that we had with a number of folks across the state to learn from them. What does becoming an anti-racist organization look like? What should the party do? What would be their recommendations? And Preeti, what were some of the things that were standing out for you? Because I know we're going to create a report for this work group to take a look at and to think about more.
Yeah, I think
one thing. Yeah.
I was really gratified and humbled to hear from many of our respondents that the first thing they really wanted to do was listen. Yeah. They felt that there needed to be an element of reflection and understanding that their point of view wasn't the only one. And to me, that was really hopeful.
Yeah, yeah. And what they also were saying was, how important it is for us to connect with community, right? To not just take their voices, but to also hear from others and to hear from the people in communities more, to understand what matters to them. And so as such, one of the things that what we wanted to do, what you will see in this journey, this timeline that we put together, and there's always the disqualifier dates, like some of these things might shift and pivot because you never know. Things might come up that we want to really address and make sure that we do. But this was our best thinking. What we wanted to do was kickstart in January with pulling together a group of people to understand, a work group from the party that works with us in defining what this process needs to look like. What you will see on this timeline is also what we call soul talks. And so the soul talks are, Peggy has been a part of our process, and she's super excited. We're going to go into communities and really have listening sessions with communities across the state, really looking to hear, what does it mean to belong? And what are the issues that matter most to them? And the interviews that we conducted, the polling that is being done across the state with communities of color, and these soul talks, which are really similar to these, but probably a little more facilitated breakout sessions, all of that, we're going to get a real good source of data that this work group will be working with over the course of January, February, March. And our hope is that in March, April, let's go to the next slide.
Actually want to just, I
Mhm.
don't want to underscore the importance of or I do want to underscore the importance of the soul talk,
Yes.
5:30 on a Saturday. The voices of communities in California are the basis, right? When we're talking about equity, when we're talking about what we're going to be thinking of as a party, I'm so excited to start with the voices of people on the ground,
Absolutely.
especially with a focus on BIPOC communities and young folks,
That's
because
right.
that also came up in our interviews, that we need to engage more young folks of color.
Absolutely. That's right. That's right. Those are going to be really exciting conversations that are going to be facilitated conversations with a large number of folks. And we're super excited about that. If we go to the next slide, what we will be doing from those soul talks, not only are we going to bring their voices into the room, we're also going to, like, part of the process, one of the things that Preeti we heard from is to not disengage, right?
Mhm.
So the soul talks, while we will be hearing from communities, we are also going to come back to the people who shared in their listening sessions and reflect back what we heard from them. Because this process of belonging, creating an environment, an organization that they see themselves in, what's super important is that they hear that you've heard them. And so coming back and sharing what we've heard is going to be important. And that the group that we are working with will also be creating a plan based on all of the information that we're getting and bringing that back to the party leadership. It's going to be a series that they're going to be going through, but they're going to be coming back to the party leadership to a session very similar to this, and actually engaging and getting your feedback on the plan that they're creating. And that way we're continuously looking at building something that all of us are participating in.
Joy, to your comment, absolutely. Diversity across multiple metrics is going to be very important to the soul talk composition. We want to make sure that we're not leaving out any communities in California, geographically, age-wise, race and ethnicity.
That's right.
There are plenty of metrics that we're using. And another thing I wanted to call out is, you'll look through the year. It's a little hard to see because there's a lot of information, but you're going to see feedback a lot, agreement. This is an iterative process on purpose, so that it really feels like it's one that is belonging to the group.
Absolutely. It's belonging to the group, and that you're engaged in it as well. So it's not just the work group that's going to be making all the decisions. It is about bringing it back to you all for feedback. And yes, they're going to keep revising it and iterating it so that what comes out of it is more of a collective thinking, not just one, a small group. So let's go ahead and just shift. Like, we'd love to get your thoughts and perspectives on like if you have any clarifying questions, and we're going to do our very best to answer as much as we can, but we want to capture all your questions, and we may not be able to answer them all right now. We want to be able to capture them and make sure that we bring something back or send something out to you to answer those questions. So if we can click through, there are 3 questions that we have. What clarifying questions do you have? And then in the chat, here are 2 things we'd love to hear from you as well. What is your greatest hope for the Democratic Party as it embarks on becoming an anti-racist organization? And then on a scale of 1 to 5, what's your readiness and willingness to champion the outcomes of this work group? And 1 is low and 5 is high. Let's just be clear about the scale. What are your greatest hope for the California Democratic Party as it embarks on becoming an anti-racist organization? And then how, like on a scale of 1 to 5, what's your readiness and willingness to champion the outcomes of this work group with your feedback incorporated? Let us know. Yeah. How can non-Black people who have been told they are model minority be particularly anti-racist? That's a great question, Michelle. It's when we think about how, when we go back to the spheres of inequity or spheres of racism, right? We are often, like, as an individual, we are navigating just all the dynamics of dominant culture, white supremacy all around us. Given the spheres that we talked about, given the structural systems that we live in and that we operate and that we move through every day, given the institutional like the institutions that live in that, and kind of the policies and the laws and the engagements that we might have. And part of our interpersonal engagements might be our family is one, right? And what we know is that, and this, I know this based on my engagement and my work with many cultures, that colonialism actually really plays a role in how in how different communities of color engage with Blackness, I think is the best way to say it. There is a relationship with Blackness due to colonization of many countries and many cultures that has shaped and influenced how we think about Blackness. And it's a deep conversation. It's one that Preeti and I have unpacked with groups and with people in coaching, but it exists. And some people say that people of color cannot be racist because of how when we define racism as power and privilege, right? Like when you combine prejudice and power, right? There's that piece of it. But people of color can be bigoted, right? We can have our we stereotype, we do all of these things, and so it exists, right? So it creates, but we operate in a greater system of racism that and we're navigating that all the time.
I would say even if you're taking the efforts to not be, by even accepting that terminology, right? The model minority is created to build differences. It's created as a leverage tool to manipulate, essentially, folks with different levels of power. And so participating in that construct itself is participating in anti-racism. And so I think part of us learning more about the history of where these concepts came from, I think, Katrina, you're right? This becomes a global conversation at some point.
It does.
But for us to just call it out, right? Call and have those honest conversations. And I think to some of the other comments I'm hearing, we have to be okay with being vulnerable, and we have to realize that, or I'll speak for myself, I am participating in racism because I am part of these structures. This is how I was raised in this country, in this world. And for me to say that doesn't make me a bad person, because that's going to shut down any learning that I want to have, right? I just need the mirror to reflect and say, this is what it is. What am I going to do about it? And really create a safe space for us to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah, I'm appreciating two of the comments in here. One is, how can you help people recognize their own racism? There's a fear of difference, right? And that's a great observation, because honestly, the country as a whole is and I've been playing around with this and noticing this over the years. I've been doing this for 10 years, that we do have an aversion to saying or recognizing difference, recognizing, appreciating, acknowledging difference, and being okay with the fact that difference exists, right? That's our biggest challenge. We all want to have shared values, and while that's great, what we also have to recognize is that some of our values might be different, and that's okay. Difference is okay. It actually is what makes this country so great. And so when we can acknowledge that, that's important. And while it's scary and sometimes it's hard to engage in conversations, like I don't believe in calling out people. I believe in calling people into a conversation. So if you're a white person who's interested in exploring, then let's have a conversation. I rather have the conversation and engage and learn from each other, right? Because when we can learn, what we know is that we learn through people's stories. When we engage and learn about each other at a depth, versus just recognizing that we have something in common, but to go beyond common and say, what is it that we have that's different? And how is your story different than my story? How has our story shaped who we are and what we want to do and become? Like, that is where the richness is. And the more we can get comfortable about that, the better it becomes and the easier it becomes. But it is oftentimes very hard to even take that first step. And I just want to appreciate the fact that this is the first step, by just acknowledging and saying out loud, you want to become an anti-racist organization, which I give huge kudos to all of you for saying you want to do this. So I'm still curious. I'm seeing some people saying a 3-4, but I want to know more. On a scale of 1 to 5, like what's your readiness and your willingness? And then and if you think about it as an education, right? These are baby steps, right? Like, what's your greatest hope for this work, for the party? I love it. I'm loving some of your comments. Yeah, Preeti?
I just want to appreciate, people are already being vulnerable and brave. and
Yeah.
really forward thinking in their comments and their questions.
Yes. And I'm noticing
Sharon.
people are bringing up conflict resolution. There's a lot. This is part of a, it's, I think these conversations can lead to conflict, and it depends on how you approach that conflict, right? Like, how do you approach it from a place of learning and growth? Like, how are we engaging in that? All of these things are things that we will be talking with the work group, and then what we want to do is think about, how do we expand it? How do we ripple this out so that everybody can participate in some form or fashion? For those of you who are really interested, ready, and willing, right? This is an important work. I'm mindful of time, and this last slide, some of you asked about, like, can we get copies of this? We wanted to offer to you just a couple of resources that might be helpful as you begin your own exploration as individuals in this process. And I invite all of you to think about, like, take some of these and think about it. If we can go to the next slide. Right. So the first one, and I'm gonna pop this also into the chat. There's a link. There's a video, the history of white people in America. That's really great. Seen on Radio, it as a podcast that I actually have loved every single series that they've done. They've done Seeing White is one. They've done one on on men is another series that they did, and a full exploration on male toxicity and how that shows up across the world. There's also a podcast series that they have on democracy, which I think you all will find very interesting and fascinating. The other in Belonging Institute with Dr. John Powell, John C. Powell, has a series of articles that are really, really lovely. And the one that Preeti and I really wanted to make sure that you all had a chance to read, if you wanted to, is called The California Story: The Structural Forces Behind Our Racial and Economic Inequality. And this one really focuses on the history of California, and really looking at the policies and practices. The last one that we thought, and Preeti, I know you've read this one a couple of times, is The Color of Law, a history of laws and policy decisions passed by local, state, and federal governments that promote racial segregation, which is really a great book.
What I love about this book is he starts with examples actually from San Francisco.
Oh, right.
Where we expect not to see, the same sort of national trend.
Exactly. Well, we appreciate you giving us time to share with you this initiative and consider this a launch. I'm really happy to see that we're getting quite a few fives of people ready and willing. I'm really excited to see that. And I look forward to working, Preeti and I both look forward to working with the work group as we explore further and learn together, and then create together, co-create what a process might look like for the party to become anti-racist.
I've seen a few questions about how you could join the working group, and I think I'm sure we'll have a way to get back to you on that.
Absolutely.
But I just want to echo Katrina's thanks and appreciation for giving us this space to be in conversation with you all today and through the next many months.
Mm. Well, thank you again. We look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great weekend.